There is 7.3 billion people on the planet Earth. There will be 9.7 billion people on planet Earth by 2050, according to the United Nations. Because of that, we will have to be ready to face the challenges that are coming closely connected to the population growth. It's not only about migration, energy sources, water and food supplies. It's going to be the challenge not only for us as a mankind, but also for our planet, planet Earth. We might live with artificial organs for much a longer period and without disease, but if our planet is going to be barren, then what's the point? Asks professor at Maastricht University, who is focused on future of agriculture and who believes that at least part of the solution should come from the lab. A part of what you eat should come from the lab. He's a lab agriculturer who is able to make in vitro burgers. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Post. Hello.
Hi.
Mark, how do your colleagues at the university call you?
Oh, they call me the Hamburger professor, yes.
Which
I kind of like.
Yeah, you do. It's
Yeah,
pretty cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell me, if this is my plate and here is the hamburger, that's the very end, that's the last step of the process, except, from eating it.
Yeah.
What should be the first step?
The first step should be to get the cells to create that hamburger. And you can get them from a cow or from other sources, but in our case, from a cow.
Walk us through, please,
Yes,
concerning this project.
Thank you. So this is going to be more focused on one particular problem that the World Health Organization and the FAO actually identified already in 2008. And it is, how are we going to feed 9 billion people with a growing appetite for meat? So this is my confession. I love meat. And I'm guessing that 95% of you are exactly the same. Who of you is vegetarian? So that's kind of correct. So 95% of the people love meat. We don't know exactly why that is, but it is what it is. And it's becoming a problem because we are going to move from 7 to 9 billion people with increasing appetites for all sorts of foods. We want to move ahead. We want to have more choices in food, not less. And that is going to be a very daunting task for the next 35 years. And meat, especially, is a problematic part of that. Why is that? That's because this is the most expensive part of our diet. It's nice. We love it. But it's very, very expensive in terms of resources, in terms of also environmental aspects. So currently, 70% of all our agricultural lands are used to produce livestock meat. It's not only cows, it's also pork and chicken and lamb and what have you. According to that FAO report of 2008, worldwide consumption of meat will increase by 70%. And you can do that math. We don't have enough space to host those animals or to feed those animals. We just are not going to make it with livestock. That means that it would become expensive according to regular economic law. It would become expensive, scarce, which would not maybe be such a bad thing. We can all live with much less meat than we are doing right now. But the other danger is that people are going to try and produce more to the detriment of our planet. Also, in that 2008 FAO report, it was stated that 15 to 20% of all our greenhouse gas emission actually comes from livestock. Again, not only cows, but cows are a big part of it because they belch. They actually don't fart methane, they belch methane, but it comes out either way. And that is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So if we want to meet those Paris guidelines, we need to start thinking about livestock as well. Another scarce resource is water. Water is going to be increasingly scarce, and beef, especially beef, is very, very water intense. For 1 kilogram of red meat, beef, it requires 15,000 liters of fresh water. It's a staggering amount of water. There's no other food source in our system that requires more water than beef. It's more than pork, it's more than chicken, and it's definitely more than all the grains that we eat. Why is that? Why are these animals such a big problem? If you look at an animal, which I kind of do, it may be somewhat disrespectful, but if you look at it as an animal of a technology that transforms its food into animal proteins for us, then it's a very, very inefficient system. So for a cow to produce a kilogram of beef, we need to feed it 7 kilograms of food, of protein-rich food, some of which we can eat ourselves. Of course, we cannot eat all that grass that they eat, but we can eat some of that ourselves. So the conversion ratio from their feed into proteins for us is very, very low, like 15%. For pigs, it's higher. For chicken, it's higher. And for salmon, it's actually pretty much 1. So we cannot really beat salmon in that respect. So that's why we are focusing on beef and see whether we can actually do something about that. Now, we can all become vegetarian. You saw a couple of people here raising their hands when I asked them whether they are vegetarian or not. And I'm sure they live very fulfilling lives. I'm sure they are healthy, I'm sure they procreate, I'm sure they're really happy. And maybe even healthier than some of the meat eaters among us. We can do that. We don't need animal proteins. That's kind of a myth that we grew up with. We don't really need animal proteins. On this planet, there are 2 billion people who are vegetarian, mostly involuntarily because they cannot afford to eat meat. But they show you every day that it can be done and that you can live normal lives. So we can all become vegetarian, and why is it that is so difficult? And actually, globally, the trend is going the reverse direction. I told you in the FAO report, 2050, 70% more meat consumption. That's not coming from Europe. That's not even coming from the Americas. That's coming from developing nations. When people start to become rich, middle-class incomes in a country rise, they start to eat meat. It's a crazy dynamic, but that's what it is. This is the human trophic level. It's where we are in the food chain. It's 1 for an animal, it's 1 for a plant, 2 for an animal that eats plants, and 3 for an animal that eats animals that eats plants. So we are at 2.35, that top curve here, meaning that 35% of our proteins come from animals that eat plants. And this is where India and China, in the last 30 years, gradually crept up to. And that's because that place where we are in the food chain, the human trophic level, is linearly related to the gross domestic product of a country. So this is what globally is going to happen. And you may think this is going to happen far away, but it's going to affect everybody. There's no question. There's differences, many, many differences between continents. This kind of displays how it's different. You see in China, it's mostly pork. You see also that in all countries, in all continents, in the BRIC continents, the meat consumption actually is going up. You see that in India, it's still very, very low. But, you know, think of it as a meat producer. This is an opportunity, right, to increase that demand there. And you don't even need to increase it. It's going on its own. So this is the future we're looking at, more meat. And again, that for meat producers in the short term might be a nice thing. And I talk a lot to meat producers, and they sort of start to gleam first. Oh, good, you know, that's a big opportunity. But then there is, again, a limit to how much we can produce. So what are the other options? Not becoming vegetarian and still, you know, we would like to continue eating meat, at least I would. So what are the other options? In 1932, Winston Churchill, so this is not a new technology, it's even not a new idea. In 1932, Winston Churchill made a remark in a book, Thoughts and Adventures, that at some point we would see it as an absurdity to grow an entire chicken while we're eating only the breast and the legs. And he envisioned that under a suitable medium, we would be able to culture that meat very efficiently. At that time, and he thought this was about 50 years hence. So we are kind of late, because at that time, the technology to do that was really not there. Yes, you could keep tissues alive outside of the body, you could actually let them grow a little bit, but you could not really grow massive amounts of meat. For that, we needed stem cells. Now, you all have heard of stem cells. Stem cells are these magical things of which our body is composed, and they pretty much can form any type of tissue. In regenerative medicine, we use them a lot. They can produce any type of tissue. What a lot of people don't know is that most of the organs in our body, most of the tissues in our body, actually also contain stem cells. Our muscle, for instance, and that of a cow, contains a lot of stem cells. And that means that if you tear your muscle, it's replaced by muscle tissue. These guys come in, they start to proliferate, they start to form tissue, and your tear in your muscle is replaced by muscle tissue and not by scar tissue. And that's a wonderful system. So the idea is very simple. You poke a cow in the butt. You get a small biopsy, let's say 1 centimeter long, 1 millimeter in diameter. You take the stem cells, there are a couple of hundred in that small sample. And those stem cells are good at two things. One is they can proliferate tremendously. And second, they can form the tissue that you like. In this case, muscle tissue, because that's meat. By the way, they can also form fat tissue, which is good for the taste and the mouthfeel and so on. So we take those stem cells out, we let them proliferate. And the proliferation capacity of these cells is tremendous, so that from a very small piece of muscle, you can create 10,000 kilos of beef, which would allow you to reduce the number of cows from 1.5 billion on this planet right now to, let's say, 35,000. And with that, reducing the amount of water, land, energy, and also reducing the greenhouse gas emission. So then you have these cells, but cells are not really protein rich. You cannot, you can eat them, but they're not really tasty, so you have to make a tissue out of it. Fortunately, the instructions in a lab, in a Petri dish to do that are very, very simple. Everybody can do that. We can do it, pretty much everybody can do it. You could do this at home at some point if you like. So one instruction is to basically starve them. And when you starve these cells, they stop proliferating and they start to form a primitive muscle fiber. Still doesn't have a lot of protein, but it already starts to contract. It's amazing, but our muscle cells are exercise junkies. They want to contract, even in a Petri dish. Our brains do not, but these are not attached to our brain, so they can contract. The second thing that they need to do is to make a tissue out of it. And we all have that experience that if you, or at least some of you may have that experience, probably not all. If you go to a gym, you have to perform labor and really pump weight, right? Lift weights to get thick muscles. Running a marathon doesn't really do it. These are all these skinny people with skinny muscles. So the exercise itself doesn't create thick, protein-rich muscles. It's the tension, the lifting weights and the tension that produces that. So we have to do two things. We have to make sure that they form a tissue. So from one myotube, they form a whole muscle bundle. And when they start to contract, which they do by themselves, that translates into tension and not just into movement. So that is very simple. We put them in a temporary gel in a ring structure so that they find each other and they squeeze out the water of the gel, they compact, they make a tissue, they align, and they start to contract. And since they're in this ring structure, they kind of compete with each other, and that induces the tension. So we basically don't do anything. We just let them, we watch them doing that thing that they do, and in 3 weeks you have a muscle fiber that under the microscope looks exactly the same as a muscle fiber from a steak that you get from the local supermarket. So what we did, we created 10,000 of these muscle fibers, put them in a patty, and then for a scientist like me, did something very, very unusual, is present it to the world in a hybrid between a cooking show and a press conference. This is a short video of it. Basically to tell the world, this technology is there. You can do this. And by the way, we also need to think about how meat production is going to come up. This hamburger, by the way, costed 250,000 euro. I don't know exactly how much that is in krona, but you get the drift. It's a lot. So it was not really a product or anything. It was just a proof of principle that you can do this. It was tasted, cooked and tasted, and identified as meat. No big surprise. Didn't have any fat tissue yet, and it was also, well, very expensive. Okay, so how do you go from there to create a product? Well, first of all, it needs to be efficient, more efficient than the cow, right? And for that, you need to scale up. Second, it needs to be sustainable, meaning that every component of this production system is of seemingly unlimited supply, either because it is or because you can make it through recycling. And third, it has to be really meat, because we are a species designed to love meat and not meat substitutes, right? So I cannot go through all the science behind this. I just don't have the time for it. But of course, scaling up of the production system is a big part of that. Looking at all the materials that go into it and changing the materials to materials that you can really source from, for instance, algae that are abundant and you can make abundant. But also adding the fat tissue so that the hamburger becomes a more sort of palatable hamburger. So there were initial life cycle analysis of, can this actually work? Can this work in terms of saving land, saving water, saving energy? That was done at the University of Oxford, where they looked at the amount of land and water and energy that was used right now for livestock production, and then looked at this technology, and it shows that you indeed could, if these assumptions are all correct, that you can reduce the number of land by 90%. We would have a lot of extra land available. The amount of water by 90%, that would be great because we have a shortage already. And the amount of energy by about 60%, depending on where you do this in the world. Now, that last number has been challenged, but you heard earlier this morning that energy is not going to be a problem, right? So that's the least of my concerns. And then there is, in addition to that efficiency and sustainability and mimicry, there's another interesting aspect that I kind of overlooked. And that was immediately clear when we presented this thing to the press. And that is that people are not really waiting for this, right? It's not immediately attractive. There's an emotional response. Very similar to what we see in other technologies like AI or robotics. We kind of have these emotional responses against it. And with something that you ingest, it's even more powerful. So it was called yuck. And I was kind of frustrated, I guess, because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what that yuck was. Very few people had tasted it. It was not about the taste. It was just an emotional response. And I tried to figure out what it was. And this was one of my dilemmas. This is localized for Czech Republic. You know these guys, right? Who of you ever eat these? Or have ever eaten them? Do you know what's in it? I hear laughter. That's a disconcerting sign. Do you want to know what's in it? No. Very clear. That's interesting. We are perfectly capable of eating stuff that we don't know how it's made, what's in it, right? No problem whatsoever. So why not a cultured hamburger, right? So one of the answers that I had to come up with, I guess, is, you guys see other people eat these hot dogs and they all stay alive, right? So it's probably regulated by the Czech government, and so you build a trust in that technology. And so that's an important part. And of course, I'm a very trustworthy person, but not everybody immediately believes me. So when I say it's safe, oh yeah, well, let's first try it. We are biologically programmed to not try new stuff, right? Because it could kill you. But if you get sort of the initial responders, the initial adopters, then at some point everybody will start eating it. So that's a matter of time. And we have early adopters enough. The second is, I think, that we want to have sort of the illusion of control over how our food is being produced. So if that's a cow, developed by 1.5 million years of evolution, in nature it's balanced, we can mess with it, but we cannot mess with it too much, right? We can give it antibiotics and growth hormones and what have you, but there's a limit to what you can do with that. And now when you transform that to a completely human-made product, people are fraudulent, they make mistakes, they are money-driven, they can do anything, right? So that's sort of the sense that we lose control over how our food is being produced. So imagine that in a neighborhood in Prague, you have a small farm, 3 cows, 3 chickens, 3 pigs, a couple of birds. These are these farms where kids go to from primary schools. They feed them, they pet them, they give them names. They're actually stem cell donors, so once in a while you poke them in the butt to get their stem cells. And in a barn adjacent to the farm, you grow meat for that neighborhood. You can visit the barn on Sundays, and you have full control over how your meat is being produced. Maybe on that farm you also grow the crops to feed those animals, and you have a very local production of hamburgers. This tells you, this may happen actually, I do believe that this may happen, but it tells you that we usually confuse the technology itself and how it's going to be implemented in society. We immediately think there's going to be large companies somewhere far away, we don't have control. That's not necessarily true. You have to distinguish those two items. And then, this one's still on. Oh, yeah. The third part is a little bit more tricky, and that's that meat is culture, right? Meat is power, meat is killing other animals, it's supremacy, it's a very masculine thing, barbecues, all that stuff, right? Bloody slabs of meat. And of course, if you make a hamburger in a lab, it becomes a very wimpy version of that meat. So I believe that this will change our culture and will drive us a little bit farther away from the original sort of hunter that we supposedly used to be at some point. We did a couple of surveys. Actually, we did one recently again, and pretty much the same comes out, that if you ask people, do you think that this is something we should do, pretty much 50% say, yeah, I think it's a good idea. They may not want to buy it in the supermarket, but they think it's a good idea. So the rationale is for everybody, I guess, pretty clear. Now, I told you about the price, $250,000. Right now, after scaling up, we could produce this for about $10 for a hamburger. 10 euro for a hamburger. That's still quite a bit, but it's way down from that 250, and we actually know where in the technology we have to tweak it to get it down to eventually the price of a hamburger that we're paying right now. So I think this is going to happen in the next 3 years. And again, that 10 euro hamburger is more for restaurants and for specialty stores, not for the supermarket. But in a couple of years after that, it will go down. You might not think of this sort of as an exponential technology, but remember the curve this morning where in the first 8 years nothing happens, and then all of a sudden you see sort of an inflection point. And I think we have seen the inflection point in this in the last year and a half. So from 2008 to 2015, 16, we were pretty much the only ones working on this. And in the last year and a half, 6 startup companies popped up. And these are only the ones that are currently visible. Some of them are focusing on chicken, some are focusing on beef, on pork. But they are there. There are also a couple of other companies that make other products like leather and milk, which is necessary. And of course, there are the vegetable-based substitutes that are getting better and better. There's no question about that. What is even more sort of impressing is that larger financiers, including large meat industries in the US, are now starting to invest in that. And Sergey Brin and Bill Gates and Richard Branson already invested in it. So there's a pretty powerful group of people behind this to push this. And I'm sure at this stage that I'm not even aware of, there are companies coming up as well. So I'm actually looking forward to a very old-fashioned idea of the future. Having a meal together, including the stuff that we like, without the negative externalities that it comes with. Because food, sharing food, may be one of the last excuses to socialize. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
I need to ask the question everybody is thinking about. How does it taste like?
All right. Was everybody thinking about that? Okay. It tastes like meat. It's very boring. It's meat. It's the same tissue.
And could you tell the difference between the, let's say, ordinary hamburger and the in vitro hamburger?
Yes. Yeah, you can, because there is no such thing as an ordinary hamburger. They're actually all artificial flavored. Ours was not artificially flavored, so yes, there is a difference.
That was a tricky answer. That was a tricky answer. Okay, I will ask the question in a different way. You have two small pieces of meat. One was in vitro cultured, second one was bought in the supermarket and came from the ordinary cow. Would you be able to tell the difference?
If it's a hamburger, no. If it's a steak, currently we cannot make steaks yet. We are working on that, but it requires additional technology. But for the steak, I cannot really answer that question. For the hamburger, you would not be able to tell the difference, no.
How does your lab farm looks like?
Oh, it's a medical lab. It's in a medical school, actually. It looks pretty much like a cell culture lab. So we have cell culture facilities and tissue culture facilities, and you would not know, other than that it has a sign, Hamburger Lab, on it.
Do you?
We were making hamburgers in there.
Do you have the sign, Hamburger Lab?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Arnie Bieber is asking, will we always need cows to grow meat?
Right. That's a good question. So in my mind, going down from 1.5 billion cows to 30,000 would be a major step forward. There are people, especially sort of orthodox vegan people, who animal welfare activists, who think that that's even not enough, that you have to get rid of those last 30,000 cows, at least for human consumption. You may use them as pets or whatever. Can you do that? Theoretically, you can. These stem cells, you can identify stem cells that go on for much longer. You can actually have immortal cell lines that you immortalize, so they actually go on forever. Currently, that requires genetic modification, and we don't want to do that, because in Europe, sort of the combination of GMO and cultured meat is a little bit too much. So that's why we don't do that. But theoretically, that possibility is there. Yeah.
And you have also mentioned that the cells that are at the very beginning of the process can be quite various. It could be also my tissue that would be at the starting line.
I don't want to talk about that. But yeah, we could.
So
get
the answer is yes.
We could get them from we could get them from any species. Yes.
Thank you for the answer.
Right.
Is in vitro meat safer than normal meat? And are there long-term studies that could compare the advantage and the disadvantage of in vitro meat? to the comparison of the meat we are having?
The second part of the question, no, there are no long-term studies yet because the product is not really there yet at scale. We can only show the composition and say, well, guys, this is the same as the composition of regular meat, so why worry about it? And probably that's what we're going to do. I didn't talk about that, but if you accept the idea of making meat this way, all sorts of opportunities arise. So we make fat tissue, and we can make fat tissue that has more omega-3 fatty acids, not by genetically modifying them, but by just feeding them a different feed source. So then that hamburger actually becomes healthier because it lowers your cholesterol. The other disease, if you like, that is associated with eating red meat, which was emphasized by the World Health Organization 2 years ago, is that the increased risk for colorectal cancer. Now, we don't exactly know what component in this meat actually drives that increased risk of colorectal cancer. Some studies claim, but they're not very conclusive, that it's actually the heme iron in the meat that drives that risk. Now, we can actually titrate the amount of heme iron that you have in that meat. Because if we grow the cells at slightly higher oxygen levels, they reduce that amount of heme iron, because that's their function, basically. So if that indeed is the driver behind increased risk for colorectal cancer, we can fix it. But if it's not, then we need to have some sort of handle how to do that.
But that's naturally just another step in the future.
Absolutely, yes.
Says the hamburger professor, the farmer, and the one who will be maybe in the future cooking your dinner. Mark Post.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.